crowd in the Roman arena was not cheering. Not yet. Tens of thousands of spectators leaned forward in uneasy silence, their eyes fixed on two figures standing in the center of the sand. They were not the warriors the crowd expected. They were women, female gladiators, standing beneath the blazing sun of ancient Rome, gripping weapons that felt heavier than their fate. And on this day, something happened that shocked the empire, because these women did something unthinkable. They refused to fight to the death. For centuries, Rome had perfected the spectacle of blood. Gladiators fought, crowds roared, death entertained an empire. But hidden within the records of ancient historians and scattered inscriptions is a darker, stranger story. A story about women forced into the arena, women who trained blood and sometimes died under the same brutal rules as male gladiators. Yet when a few of them dared to resist the ultimate command, to kill or be killed, the consequences were far more terrifying than the arena itself. And the truth is, the Roman Empire did not know what to do with them. Because the presence of female gladiators, known in Latin as Gladiatrices, was controversial from the very beginning. Their existence challenged the rigid expectations of Roman society. In a world where women were expected to remain modest, obedient, and invisible in public life, these fighters stood in armor before thousands of spectators. To some Romans, it was thrilling. To others, it was deeply disturbing. But before we can understand what happened to the women who refused to fight to the death, we need to step back into the world that created them. A world where power, spectacle, and cruelty shaped the rhythm of daily life. Ancient Rome was a civilization obsessed with strength. Victory in battle built the empire, discipline maintained it, and public entertainment reminded citizens who held power. Nothing embodied this philosophy more than the gladiatorial games. The games began centuries earlier, originally as funeral rituals meant to honor the dead with combat. But over time, these ceremonies evolved into massive public spectacles. By the height of the empire, arenas like the Colosseum could hold more than 50,000 spectators. Crowds gathered to watch wild animals tear prisoners apart, criminals executed in elaborate performances, and professional gladiators battle in carefully staged fights. These fighters were usually slaves, prisoners of war, or condemned criminals. Some volunteered, desperate for fame or fortune. Once they entered the gladiatorial schools, known as ludi, their lives changed forever. They trained relentlessly under strict discipline. Their bodies were hardened through brutal exercises. Every movement was practiced again and again until it became instinct. Survival in the arena depended on skill, endurance, and luck. But even among the hardened fighters of Rome, female gladiators stood apart. Their appearance in the arena was rare, and that rarity made them fascinating. The earliest references to female gladiators appear during the late Roman Republic, but they became more visible during the first centuries of the empire. Wealthy elites and emperors occasionally staged spectacles featuring women fighters to impress the crowds. Roman writers often described these events with a mixture of curiosity and outrage. One historian recorded how Emperor Nero once organized games where noble women were forced to fight in the arena. Another writer described female gladiators battling under torchlight during lavish night performances. These events were designed to shock, entertain, and demonstrate imperial power. But the reality for the women inside the arena was far less glamorous. Many were slaves or prisoners, captured during Rome's endless wars. Others were criminals condemned to the games as punishment. Some may even have volunteered, drawn by the promise of fame or the slim hope of earning freedom. But once inside the gladiatorial system, choice disappeared. Training was harsh. The instructors who oversaw gladiators were known as lanistae, men who treated fighters as valuable but expendable property. Gladiators were fed high-energy diets, forced through exhausting drills, and disciplined with brutal punishments. Female fighters endured the same treatment. Archaeological evidence suggests that they trained with the same weapons as male gladiators: short swords, shields, spears, and curved blades. Some specialized in particular fighting styles, mirroring the categories used by male fighters. But while the training was real, the purpose of female gladiators was often spectacle. Their presence in the arena shocked the audience, and shock was exactly what the organizers wanted. Roman society was deeply structured by gender expectations. Women were supposed to be modest, obedient, and confined to domestic roles. A woman wielding a sword in front of thousands of spectators challenged those expectations in a way that fascinated and disturbed the Roman public. The crowd watched closely, every movement, every strike, because this was not just combat, it was controversy turned into entertainment. But even within this strange world of spectacle, there were rules. Gladiatorial combat was not always a fight to the death. Despite what modern movies often portray, many matches were carefully controlled. Skilled gladiators were valuable investments, and their owners preferred them alive. Fighters often battled until one was wounded or exhausted. At that point, the defeated gladiator might raise a finger in surrender, appealing to the crowd and the event's sponsor for mercy. Sometimes the crowd spared them, sometimes they did not. But when it came to female gladiators, expectations could change dramatically. Because the spectacle demanded something more shocking, and that is where the story begins to turn darker. Roman historians hint at a disturbing reality. Female gladiators were often expected to perform dramatic, deadly matches designed to amaze the crowd. Their fights were sometimes arranged specifically to end in death. The audience came for blood, and the empire rarely disappointed. But not every woman who entered the arena accepted that fate quietly. Some resisted, some refused to kill, and a few made a choice that would bring down the full wrath of Roman authority. The arena sand was already stained red when it happened. Two female gladiators stood facing each other beneath the scorching sun. Around them, thousands of spectators roared with anticipation. The fight had already begun. Blades had clashed, shields had splintered. But suddenly, one of the fighters lowered her weapon. Then the other did the same. For a moment, confusion spread through the crowd. This was not part of the spectacle. Gladiators were supposed to fight, to struggle, to bleed, and if necessary, to die. But these women refused. They stepped back from each other, their weapons hanging loosely in their hands. The arena fell into a strange, uneasy silence. The crowd did not know how to react. Some shouted in anger. Others laughed nervously, because in Rome, defying the rules of the arena was more than disobedience. It was a challenge to the system itself. The sponsor of the games, often a wealthy magistrate or even the emperor, was responsible for maintaining order in the spectacle. And if the crowd became restless, the consequences could be severe. The arena was not just entertainment, it was propaganda, a display of Roman power, discipline, and control. Two women refusing to kill each other threatened that illusion. At first, officials likely ordered the fight to continue. The fighters may have been threatened, whipped, forced back toward each other. But the sources suggest that sometimes, even then, the women refused. And when that happened, the punishment was swift, because Rome had little patience for defiance. Some fighters who refused combat were executed immediately in the arena, not as gladiators but as criminals. Others were dragged away to face even worse punishments beyond the view of the crowd. Ancient punishments could be unimaginably cruel. Condemned prisoners might be thrown to wild animals, crucified along public roads, burned alive as part of theatrical executions. For women who defied the arena's rules, mercy was rare. And yet, despite these terrifying consequences, there are hints that resistance continued. Because the truth is, many of these women were not warriors by choice. They were prisoners trapped inside Rome's brutal system of entertainment, and sometimes, even the threat of death could not force them to become executioners. Everything was about to change. As the Roman Empire grew wealthier and more powerful, criticism of female gladiators began to spread among the elite. Some Roman writers saw the practice as a symbol of moral decline. They argued that forcing women into violent public spectacles dishonored Roman tradition. Satirists mocked the idea of aristocratic women training with swords. Philosophers complained that the games corrupted society. But the real turning point came during the reign of an emperor who believed Rome had gone too far. His name was Domitian, and his fascination with spectacle would bring female gladiators into the spotlight like never before. Under Domitian, the games became even more extravagant. Nighttime fights illuminated by torches, battles staged in flooded arenas, exotic animals imported from distant provinces. And among these spectacles were female gladiators. Some of the emperor's events featured women fighting each other in dramatic matches designed to astonish the crowd. The audience loved it, but not everyone in Rome approved. Behind the scenes, political tensions were growing. Senators, philosophers, and traditionalists began to argue that the empire was losing its dignity. They saw female gladiators not as entertainment, but as a symbol of decadence. The debate grew louder, and eventually it reached the ears of another emperor. An emperor who would make a decision that changed the fate of female gladiators forever. But before that happened, there was one more brutal chapter in their story, because the women who refused to fight to the death had already discovered something terrifying. In Rome, survival in the arena did not always mean freedom. Sometimes, surviving meant facing something even worse. In Rome, survival did not always mean mercy. Sometimes it meant humiliation, sometimes exile, and sometimes a punishment designed not only to destroy the body, but to erase the person entirely from memory. For the women who had refused to fight to the death, the empire reserved a special kind of cruelty. Because refusal was more than disobedience, it was defiance. And Rome did not tolerate defiance. In the vast machinery of Roman law and spectacle, gladiators were not seen as individuals. They were property, tools of entertainment, living weapons designed to satisfy the bloodlust of the crowd. When a gladiator failed to perform their role, they were no longer valuable. They became expendable. But female gladiators created a strange problem for Roman authorities. Their presence in the arena was already controversial. Some Romans viewed them as shocking curiosities. Others saw them as embarrassing symbols of moral decay. When these women openly refused to kill, the spectacle became even more complicated. The audience came expecting violence. Instead, they saw resistance, and that resistance could spread. Imagine the atmosphere inside a Roman amphitheater when a fight suddenly stopped. Tens of thousands of spectators packed into towering stone seats, vendors shouting through the crowd, the smell of sweat, dust, and blood drifting through the hot air. For hours the crowd had watched animals ripped apart, prisoners executed, warriors clashing in brutal combat. Then suddenly silence, two fighters lowering their weapons. It shattered the illusion that Rome controlled everything. That illusion had to be restored. Sometimes the officials reacted immediately. Guards entered the arena, whips cracked against the sand. The fighters were forced back into position, ordered to continue the fight while the crowd screamed in anger. But if the women still refused, the punishment escalated. Some ancient accounts suggest that fighters who disobeyed commands were executed publicly as an example to others. Instead of dying as gladiators in honorable combat, they were reclassified as criminals. That meant a different fate entirely. One punishment involved damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. This was not a battle. It was an execution. The condemned prisoner would be dragged into the arena unarmed while cages were opened around them. Lions, leopards, bears, animals starved and enraged. The crowd watched as the victim tried desperately to escape. Few survived. Another punishment was crucifixion. Victims were nailed or tied to wooden crosses and left to die slowly under the sun. Sometimes this happened along public roads where travelers could see the bodies for days. It was meant to send a message, defy Rome. And this is what happens. For women who had refused to fight, these punishments carried an additional layer of humiliation. Roman society already believed that women should not appear in the arena. To be condemned publicly afterward reinforced the idea that they had violated the natural order. Their suffering became part of the spectacle. But not all punishments were immediate death. Some women were returned to the gladiatorial schools, and life there could be just as brutal. The gladiator schools were not merely training centers. They were prisons. High walls surrounded the compounds. Armed guards patrolled the entrances. Inside, fighters lived under strict discipline. Every hour of the day was controlled. They woke before sunrise. Training began immediately. Wooden swords were swung again and again against posts called palace. Shields were lifted until arms burned with exhaustion. Footwork drills were repeated across the dusty training yard while instructors watched closely. Mistakes were punished, sometimes with beatings, sometimes with starvation. For fighters who had refused combat, discipline became even harsher. They were seen as rebellious property. Dangerous examples that might inspire others to resist, and resistance inside a gladiator school was extremely dangerous. The memory of Spartacus still haunted Rome. Nearly a century earlier, a group of gladiators led by a Thracian fighter named Spartacus had escaped from their training school and started one of the most terrifying slave rebellions in Roman history. For 2 years they fought Roman armies across Italy. Cities burned. Legions were defeated. The rebellion was eventually crushed, but the fear it created never disappeared. Roman authorities were determined never to allow something like that to happen again. So discipline inside gladiator schools became relentless. Female fighters who resisted could be isolated, starved, or forced into endless training drills until their bodies collapsed from exhaustion. The goal was simple: break their will, and eventually many of them were forced back into the arena. Because the games never stopped, the Roman public demanded spectacle constantly. Festivals, religious celebrations, political events. Almost every occasion was an excuse to stage gladiatorial contests, and female gladiators remained a powerful curiosity. Crowds were fascinated by them. Roman writers often described these women as fierce, muscular, and highly trained. Some accounts mention women fighting with the same skill and determination as male gladiators. One remarkable piece of evidence comes from a stone relief discovered in the ancient city of Halicarnassus. It depicts 2 female gladiators fighting each other with swords and shields. Their names are recorded beneath them: Achulia and Amazon. Both are shown in identical armor. Both stand proudly as warriors. And the inscription beneath the image reveals something surprising. It says they were both granted freedom after the fight, which suggests something extraordinary happened. Neither woman died. Neither was executed. The match ended in a draw, and both fighters were honored. This rare record hints at a complicated truth about female gladiators. While many suffered brutal fates, others may have gained fame, respect, and even freedom. Some fighters who survived multiple battles became celebrities. Crowds cheered their names. Graffiti scratched into Roman walls sometimes mentioned popular gladiators, praising their victories. Some historians believe female fighters could achieve similar recognition. But even success in the arena could not protect them forever, because powerful voices in Rome were growing increasingly uncomfortable with the spectacle. One Roman poet mocked wealthy women who trained as gladiators, describing them as obsessed with violence and fame. Philosophers argued that forcing women to fight degraded Roman values. To them, the games were becoming a symbol of excess, a sign that the empire had lost its moral direction. And eventually the debate reached the imperial throne. In the year 200 AD, the Roman Emperor Septimius Severus made a decision that would end the era of female gladiators. Severus was a powerful and disciplined ruler who believed in restoring traditional Roman values. During his reign, he expanded the empire's borders and strengthened its military power. But he also believed that certain spectacles had gone too far. According to the Roman historian Cassius Dio, Severus attended games where women fought in the arena. The spectacle disturbed him, not because it was violent. Rome was accustomed to violence, but because it seemed to mock the dignity of Roman society. Women fighting publicly in armor before cheering crowds clashed with the traditional image of Roman virtue. And so Severus issued an imperial decree. Women were banned from participating in gladiatorial combat. The era of the Gladiatrices came to an abrupt end. The arenas that had once displayed their battles would never see them again. But the ban did not erase the suffering they had endured, nor did it erase the stories of those who resisted. Because the truth is, female gladiators were more than curiosities in Roman entertainment. They were individuals trapped within one of history's most brutal systems. Some fought fiercely, some gained fame, and some refused to kill, refused to die on command. Their defiance may have been rare, but it revealed something powerful about the nature of the Roman arena. Because the games depended on obedience, every part of the spectacle, from the roaring crowds to the glittering armor, was designed to reinforce Rome's authority. When a gladiator raised their sword, they were performing more than combat. They were reinforcing the empire's message. Rome decides who lives. Rome decides who dies. But when someone lowered their weapon and refused, for a moment, that illusion cracked. And the crowd saw something unexpected. Not just a fighter, but a human being choosing dignity over survival. The sands of the Roman arenas have long since been swept clean. The crowds are gone. The empires that once ruled the Mediterranean have faded into history. But the stories remain. Stories carved into stone reliefs. Stories hidden in ancient texts. Stories whispered across centuries. They remind us that even inside systems built on cruelty and power, there were moments when individuals refused to surrender their humanity. Moments when courage appeared in the most unlikely places. In the middle of an arena, under the eyes of an empire, with thousands of spectators watching. A woman lowering her weapon and choosing not to kill. And perhaps that quiet act of resistance tells us something deeper about history itself. Empires rise through strength, but they are remembered through the choices people make within them. Sometimes the greatest act of bravery is not victory. Sometimes it is refusal. The refusal to become what power demands. And in that moment, history changes, not through bloodshed, but through defiance. Because even in the most brutal arenas of the ancient world, not everyone chose to fight. And that choice echoes across time.